welcome to Canonical. I'm James Shao, and I'm joined by Ed Darris and Sam Spieler.
Hello.
Hello.
Good evening. Today we are continuing our series on Afrofuturism with Colson Whitehead's The Intuitionist. If you want to join our discussion, you can find our book club on Reddit by clicking on the link in the episode description. You can support us in your local bookstore using our bookshop.org link, which is also in our episode description. On that store page, you can find the books for our book club and other books that we recommend. And we are also on social media at Canonical Pod. Next week, we will be having an in-depth discussion of this book. We hope you'll join us for that one as well.
So this is my pick.
A good pick.
Yeah.
Finally.
Hey.
Actually, Sam, your picks are usually pretty good.
Thank you.
Usually, yeah.
Yeah, usually. I feel like just as with Parable of the Sower, we're skirting the boundaries of our theme with this book. This book is noteworthy because it's the debut novel of a cherished author, Colson Whitehead, who we've discussed at some length before, particularly when we read his book Sag Harbor as part of our Race in Contemporary America series, which was back in episodes 10 and 11, I think. Also, while the premise is about elevator inspectors, which I know sounds kind of odd on its face, there are undercurrents about race, sex, class struggle, glass ceilings, and the so-called American dream.
Colson Whitehead, being a member of the Double Pulitzer Club, is probably the biggest name in American fiction right now, I would say, like contemporary American fiction.
Yeah, so that's the main reason I think why people would read this book. Even though this book is a good read on its own, I feel like the reason why people would seek this out is because of Colson Whitehead. He's overshadowed the book.
And this is his debut novel, but it's very strong. I think for a debut, it's phenomenal.
Obviously, he didn't get the Pulitzer for this, but this is a pretty good out of the gate showing.
I think this was a runner-up for a PEN, and I think it lost to Interpreter of Maladies, which makes sense because that's amazing.
Yeah.
Like, if I had to choose between these two, I would probably also go for Jhumpa Lahiri's Interpreter of Maladies, but This is also really good. Like, it would be close.
So this book is about Lila Mae Watson, who is an unnamed city's first Black female elevator inspector. Unnamed, but we can take it to be New York. And she gets blamed for an unlikely catastrophic failure of an elevator that she inspected. As she tries to discover what really happened to that elevator, she's forced into the middle of the two warring factions of elevator inspection methods. The empiricists, who follow the basic rules and guidelines to ascertain elevator maintenance, and intuitionists, who divine elevator issues through more mystical methods, as their name implies. They kind of feel what is wrong with an elevator. And that is the group that she belongs to. There's also intrigue around her hero, James Fulton, the father of intuitionism, his legacy, mostly in the form of the search for a theoretical perfect elevator. Slight spoiler, I suppose. And the future of city structure and design, as well as Lila Mae's work and race.
This book was the first book actually that I had chose for that series on race in America. I was really interested by the theme of the elevator inspector. I thought that was really interesting, but also how it kind of examines the mixture of whiteness and rationality and blackness and irrationality. So it seems kind of goofy on the face of it, but I think it's actually a substantial examination.
I felt this was, as we've already said, very strong writing. Occasionally, I had the feeling like Whitehead was trying hard to impress and use his $5 words. He's very witty, but it feels like he wants you to know that he knows that he is. I felt this way in Sag Harbor also, but it fit well in that book because the main character based on him is kind of a big nerd. But it does work here too. It has this slight nod to how hard-boiled mysteries feel the kind of noir aspect, but it's still noticeable. It has the feel of a debut work for me, even though it is very well done.
I think one key difference is in Sag Harbor, it's a retrospective narrator, and here it's just a narrator. A very idiosyncratic narrator, I think. Someone who definitely voices his opinion the way that the voice is. The voice is quite strong. I think that adds to it, or you might even say detracts from it. It just depends on how you feel about that narrator.
Well, Sam, you mentioned that it's a debut novel and you feel like you can tell that it's a debut novel. What do you mean by that?
In that it feels like he's trying really hard to display his wittiness. With Sag Harbor, it already felt like he knew what he was doing. He's settled into his ways. Here it feels like he's still navigating that. He goes on, he's got digressions, and they are interesting digressions, but he takes them to extremes. I mean, obviously, Sag Harbor was a very different sort of book, but he doesn't really do that in Sag Harbor. Here, he kind of runs with things.
I think that the difference for me between this and other works is that he is less restrained here. He doesn't keep himself to the main topic. Because he is so confident, he's willing to go off on tangents, probably more than he should. But this is one of those rare novels, for me at least, where he's so confident but simultaneously so good that even though you kind of wish sometimes that he would focus on the main point, everything that he adds is still really good.
Oh, yeah. There are so many different layers and so many different things going on here that not all of them are very apparent, and they're not even necessary to pick up. But when you do a little digging and discover just how much there is, it's pretty impressive. For example, if I can find it, there is a section where he gives the speech of the Vice President of the United States, who is giving a speech at the New York City 1853 exhibition of the Industry of All Nations. And it's this speech that's about like equality and moving forward. And it's notable because, it's given by a white guy at a time when there was definitely nothing close to equality in the US. But first of all, that speech doesn't really exist, but he also didn't create it. Apparently, he lifted heavily from a 1851 London World's Fair, and it was given by England's Prince Albert. Not only that, but in 1853, the US didn't even have a vice president. The president was Franklin Pierce, and his vice president had died a little bit before and was not replaced. So there's all these weird, not super important details, but they're interesting. And I think this is important just to the point that this speech, as originally given, was not about this sort of deliverance.
Yeah.
The way it is given here.
It has these layers and they are digressive, but because they're all very well formed and they have interest in and of themselves, I almost don't feel that it's a fault with the book so much as just a limitation of the reader, that it's very difficult for a reader to follow all of these threads at the same time. So it's like he's built a book that rewards rereading, and that's not really a problem in my book.
So I will disagree with you here, Yed, but not very much so, in that I think it's evident that Whitehead's writing, if you had read this when it was published, I think it'd be evident to you that Whitehead is an immensely talented writer, like someone you have to watch and read. And I would say that almost everything is done at a high level. The world building, the plotting, characterization, prose, especially the prose. It's all done so well But I would say, in concurrence with Sam, that what limits the book from being great is he needs to rein in some of that impulse, that tendency to riff. Because even though it's delightful, the process of reading is delightful, I think it actually detracts from what he might have intended with the book. It's so sprawly that by the end of it, you appreciate the experience of reading it, but I don't think you take too much from it. And given what he has attempted to do in his later works, it seems to me his ambition from the very beginning is to write an important book in quotation marks. And I feel like this book is attempting to be an important book, but it doesn't get there because he just has too much fun. He just ends up writing a beautiful passage about, who this guy is and how he ended up here, or the passage about, like, I think it's 16 different types of elevators. Like, reading that is really interesting. And when you're reading it, you feel totally immersed in the world he's creating. But when you pull out, you really, I think, wonder, well, okay, but what does this build toward besides the world? Like, as a writer who's trying, I think, to do something important, what is this doing to help you achieve that aim? I think, though, that this is me projecting that this is what I think he wants to do because he has gone on to do these things. If you just set aside all those kinds of expectations and you're just reading a book for fun, I think this book is totally fine and you would love this book.
What it reminds me a lot of is another book that we've read recently, Pale Fire. I think we have the same sort of digressiveness in that novel, but we appreciate it more readily because we see it as more intentional, probably. I think that this novel is full of the same sort of nuggets that you have to read and reread to get at. And I agree in the general spirit that including all of those nuggets detracts from the overall theme, but there is space within literature for this kind of sprawling, encyclopedic, hyper intense novel that includes lots of textual and paratextual elements. I don't think that it has to be this big, important novel that you're talking about. It can be, and Whitehead can do that, but I don't think we necessarily know that that's what he was trying to do here.
Yeah, I think there is room for that in literature. I'm not saying that you can't have this kind of digressive or riffy novel. I think what I'm saying is if he just dialed it back a little bit, just a little, like dialed it back 10% and pruned it, I think it would have been a more effective novel. But it doesn't mean that it's not a successful novel, because it is. At the end of reading it, I don't think I take a lot out of it besides the pleasure of reading it.
I suppose for me, my thoughts are a bit more positive. I find that this novel is successful on two counts. First, when we talk about the theme of competing camps of elevator inspectors, it sounds kind of ridiculous. I was expecting it to be kind of a wacky idea, and it wasn't. I thought it would be played more for the comedy or the ridiculousness, but it allowed itself to move beyond that, which I think was really important for me to really understand this as a work of art with something to say rather than something that's fun to read. It takes the idea of uplift beyond just the point of referring to racial progress, and it becomes something bigger. It's an idea into itself. And also the mystery elements that, Sam, you mentioned earlier, I thought that those were done really well, but I was feeling towards the middle of the novel that it was almost being overdone. And it saves itself from being a genre exercise at the end of the novel, when I felt like a lot of the mystery tropes were left behind and the thematic concerns of the novel really moved back into the forefront. So I thought that was done really well. And I think that's what really pushed this novel, in my mind, as far as, in terms of craft. I think this is probably the strongest thing that we've read.
I mean, I know you really liked Stoner. You thought Stoner was an exquisitely crafted novel. Do you think this was better crafted? It's very different. Stoner's very neat and refined.
I think I make a distinction here that perhaps you two don't make. I would say that in terms of craft, this is definitely the best thing. But in terms of artistry, maybe not, because I like a book like The Limeworks, which I think both of you really didn't like. And I thought in terms of artistry, that was a much bolder and stronger and more idiosyncratic artistic statement, even if in terms of craft, it wasn't as successful or as virtuosic.
How are you defining those two things in this context?
In terms of craft, where we see the craft on display is the strong sentences. On a sentence level, Whitehead is a phenomenal writer. Every sentence is beautiful. All of the imagery is beautiful. Sometimes the scene work is a little bit difficult to follow because he does riff, like you said, but the world building is wonderful. The dialogue is good. The suspense is there. The plotting is there. The pacing is there. Like all of these things that are important in the craft of fiction, Whitehead nails. But the thematic things are not there as much. And this is, a consequence of that riffing that you guys were talking about. He doesn't hone in on a particular theme in the same way that another writer might, like another Thomas Bernhard might.
What did you think about the main character? What do you think about Lila Mae Watson? Like, what kind of person is she, do you think?
In my mind, Condoleezza Rice.
I can see that, yeah.
That's who she is. Not necessarily her personality, but just the way she looks.
But that's only because you've fantasized about Lisa Rice for a long time.
Oh, Condi, come back to us. Condi, where you been hiding? Come back to the spotlight. We miss you.
So the reason I ask is because I bounced a lot between different images that I had of her. At the very beginning, she seemed really rigid, and I had this kind of image that she was on the autism spectrum.
What?
Like very high functioning, some form of Asperger syndrome. In the beginning of the book, and then in various other scenes, she felt kind of mechanical to me. Like she has a personality, but so much of the personality is built around elevators. And later on, race does definitely come into it. But when she's really focused on the elevators, I think it's partly just because she is an intuitionist, and maybe Whitehead is tapping into this idea, this kind of mysticism, that she doesn't function the way other people function. But it did feel not just nerdy, but something beyond that.
I didn't feel that. I did feel perhaps that she was a loner at first, but as I kept reading, I was surprised by how tough she was. Like when I first started reading, I thought, oh, an elevator inspector, she's going to be more Clark Kent and less Superman. But then she falls in with all of this trouble and organized crime, and she's not scared. Like there are people out there who are ready to hurt her, and she doesn't back down.
Well, see, I think that was one of the reasons why I started getting this feeling. Is it's not that her character changes throughout the book in this way, but it just felt like in some instances it felt like strength to me, and in some instances it felt odd.
One thing I could say that I could fault this novel with is that we don't know her. We don't know her well enough to know who she is outside of the particular conflict that we find in this novel. We know something about her family, and we know something about her father and his experience with elevators, but she is this kind of a void. Like when she finds herself in these situations and she's tough, I didn't feel like it was a conflict because I didn't think that I knew her to be weak before. It was just like, oh, wow,
Yeah, it's this weird kind of dynamic where you have a really good idea of her history, but her history actually doesn't inform the reader about her present.
Yeah.
Like, even though you have that wonderful story, extremely well rendered, about her in the middle of the night going to get a glass of water and running into her father, and she doesn't know how to read the description of an elevator. You get that, and the only thing you take from it is from a young age, she had someone else in her life who also cared a lot about elevators. Like, I think that's the only thing you take away from it. I don't think you really take anything else. And also the sense of horror from that story, because it transitions from another kind of terrible thing. I think it was around the time of the warehouse scene. But that's the problem. Like, on a technical level, he's rendered the scene excellently, and he's done what you should do as a writer, which is to give the character background. But what do you actually take from it as a reader? Like, you don't actually take much from it on a thematic level, I'd say, or really all that much on a characterization level. So, yeah, I mean, technically it's well done, but when you try to look at it as a coherent whole, that's where it falls apart for me, where I feel like, okay, he knows what he needs to do, but he hasn't put in that final stitch. He hasn't sewn it all together, but he's close. So, yeah, I mean, I agree with you.
What it is for me is like, yeah, there is something missing because of that riffing that you were talking about earlier. There's so much of that that you don't notice what's missing. Like, it doesn't feel empty. It doesn't feel like something should have been added until you go looking for it.
So, in that way, it's like Sam said, it feels like a debut novel. Like, he's got all the tools, but he's raw and he doesn't know how to put it all together yet. But you could see, like, when he figures out how to put all of his like mastery together, he's gonna just knock it out. But right now, it's just all kind of there, like in a nebulous blob.
I mean, that's true, but I think, I still stand by the idea that you don't know it's missing unless you want it. And when I was reading, I didn't notice it was missing. And I didn't even notice it was missing until just now when Sam asked me about her. Like, I don't feel like knowing a lot more about her personality would really matter to me, because there's enough other things in this novel for me to like.
Yeah. And also, the book that this gets compared to a lot, The Crying of Lot 49, does not have very strong characterization. It's very similar to this book. But where this book, I think, doesn't succeed on that level is this book is trying to characterize her. Whereas in The Crying of Lot 49, I don't remember the main character, the woman's name. I don't think Pynchon is trying to characterize her. Like, she could be any person. So once again, for me, it's the attempt that demarcates this book from other books. Like, he's obviously trying to do something. It's a bit like Animating the Dead, in that for me, like, you can't really say exactly what it is that's missing, but there's some magic in that animation that's not quite there. But all the pieces are there. It's just not quite alive. And I'm saying this as someone who wants a really good book. It's so good already. It's just not alive enough to reach that next threshold. Let's take a break, but before we do, I just want to let you know that we've referred to quite a few books already in our discussion, and if you want to listen to those conversations, you can go to our show notes on Reddit. We'll link you to all the books that we referred to in our discussion today. So let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll compare this book to Sag Harbor and talk about who we would recommend The Intuitionist to. We'll be right back. Welcome back. So let's compare this book to the other novel that we read of Whitehead's, Sag Harbor. Did you find any similarities in theme? Could you see any differences in Whitehead's attitude to his subject matter, since this book was written about 10 years before Sag Harbor?
Overbearing fathers.
Yeah.
That's part of it.
Strong voice.
I think that his attitude towards race is quite complicated, and I think we'll probably dive deeper into that in the next episode on this novel, but he has a very particular way of thinking about blackness that I think is present in both novels. It's not, at least in my reading, the mainstream attitude.
It's definitely not a simple take on race. There are different layers. It's complicated by understanding histories and understanding people living in their own particular realities. Pompey, for example, who I'm sure we'll discuss next week.
Yeah, I think that Whitehead has a very knowing perspective as an author. He is entering into the discourse having seen so much of it already. He doesn't, to my mind, reiterate a lot of the existing ideas about race in America. Instead, he kind of assumes a lot of understanding from the reader, and he advances something that's quite new and refreshing. So to my mind, I think that's one of his strengths.
So we all liked this book. I think we liked it quite a lot, in fact. Who would you recommend this book to? Is this one of those rare books that you might recommend to everybody?
I would. There certainly are people that won't like it or won't enjoy it as much.
Racists.
Yeah. But I don't know that I could identify those people other than maybe people who don't like deeper meanings or don't like digression. They want a straight A to B story.
If you're a dum-dum, you won't like it. That's what you're saying, Sam.
Pretty much, yeah.
I think that everyone can like this book, and I think that people who care about the craft of fiction will especially like this book. Like, if you are a writer or you think a lot about writing, reading Whitehead is really a pleasure because he is so strong.
Yeah, and people that want to fill out their Whitehead shelf, I don't think this is something they should skip. Having only read 2 of his books, I definitely want to read the more famous ones. But yeah, this is an excellent read and more fun than Sag Harbor, even though Sag Harbor felt more finished in some ways. Well, that's not the right word.
No, I'd agree with you. It's a little bit more self-contained.
It's a little tighter.
Yeah, it feels more refined. But it doesn't mean it's a better read, though. I think this novel is more entertaining.
Oh, yeah.
One thing I'll say, though, is I read half this book and I listened to half this book on audiobook. And I would, in fact, recommend the audiobook in that this is such a voice-driven narrative that when you listen to the audiobook, it's great. Like, you get I would say a different experience, a more enjoyable experience. But the downside is because of the section breaks not being sectioned off by chapters, it's actually really confusing when you listen to the audiobook because you don't know when he's jumping off onto one of his riffs and you don't know what he's talking about. But it's a very strange experience. I don't know if I would prefer it to reading the text copy, but it's very different. So if you were to consume this book twice, doing it once with text and once with audiobook actually does feel very different, I think. All right, let's conclude here. Thank you for listening. If you thought we were way off base with our review, you can let us know on Reddit. That link is in the episode description. You can also find us on social media at Canonical Pod. And if you enjoyed this episode, please go ahead and check out our other episodes. You can also leave us a nice review on Apple or on your podcast platform of choice. That really helps us and gets the word out, lets other people know that, this podcast is worth listening to. We'll be back next week with an in-depth discussion of The Intuitionist. If you're interested in joining that discussion, go and find a copy of the book so you can join in. Till next time, happy reading. We'll talk to you soon.